Okay. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Today we have a really special guest, thanks to Deb Philman, Courtenay Turner. She is the host of the Courtenay Turner podcast, and honestly, I think she is one of the best researchers out there. I see her as a kind of beacon of truth. Her podcast really makes a difference. Make sure you follow it. What I really appreciate is how she takes really complex topics and explain them in a way that just makes so very much sense. So I'm truly excited to have you here today. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much for having me. And I really appreciate the kind words.
It's my pleasure. So I would like to begin and say something like that. I see that we are like in the middle of some kind of an historical war between the controlled collective, powered by and manipulated and weaponized by, and the collective is being manipulated by weaponized philosophies. And it's like the war is against the free and responsible individual and the family unit. And I would like to know what is your take on it, and can you maybe explain to us or map out and how it was played out historically, and how should we recognize those dangerous philosophies, and eventually, hopefully, we can go into Hegel and his dialectic and things like that.
Absolutely. Well, I'm not sure that I can unpack millennia in a few minutes here, but I will do my best to give the highlights.
Yes.
I think that we can look at this as I love the way you framed this. It's really a battle between the individual and really, what to me, I think the cornerstone of that is free will. I think free will is from my perspective, it's a gift from God to the individual. And I think one of the biggest mistakes that people make is that people think about free will as freedom. And when you talk about these various religions going all the way, and I would classify them as religions, although oftentimes they're couched in philosophical premises, I do think that they're very faith based, whether or not they put that as their exoteric message. I do think they're very faith oriented, and they tend to orient towards the collective, towards the one. Some of the more modern versions of this would be the collective unconscious, the noosphere, Teilhard de Chardin, the collective intelligence, as some of the newer, more theosophical kind of like the game B proponents would call it. And they talk about freedom, but they talk about freedom as an end, freedom towards the collective of humanity. And that's not the same thing as free will. And I think that's really what's at jeopardy right now. That's really what is at stake, is this notion of free will and the concept of free will, which is a vehicle. It's a vehicle for virtue and for morality. But it is up to the individual to choose that path. And I do believe that is a gift. That's a gift that we each have, but it is also something that has to be exercised. And freedom is an end result. So some of the very prominent thinkers who would be familiar to people are like Nietzsche, who talks about will to power. This is a notion of freedom as an end. Or Aleister Crowley, who talks about, his dilemma quote, cult. And he talks about, do what thou wilt. Right. This is also, we may know, some of your audience may be familiar with at least the term Illuminati. Right. And
Mhm.
this was very much something that Adam Weishaupt had also adopted, this very Thelemian type of notion of do what thou wilt. But this is all oriented towards freedom as an end. And I think that's really the cornerstone of it, is these, the people who believe that the individual is sacred and made in the image of the creator, and that we have this gift, and that it is our duty to exercise the gift and hopefully to use it as a vehicle towards virtue and morality. Versus those who see, a freedom as an end result, where we have essentially we create a collective unity where that free will is eviscerated, and we all move towards a collective one. I don't know if
Mhm.
that did any kind of, yeah.
Yes.
And I'm happy to break it down and go through specifics in any part of that.
Yeah, I would really like to know who, in your opinion, are the main philosophers. I suppose that you would consider them as Gnostic or Hermetic philosophers. And how do you recognize the poison? Because they are so subtle in the
Mm-hmm.
way they deliver their message, right? They actually speak to our high moral ground, trying to convince us in equality, in goodness, and all the rest of it. And in the meantime, taking our everything.
Yes. So in my book, and it's not finished, but I do have quite a bit of it up available for my Substack. So if those want to take a look at that, that's Courtney's Substack. I spell my name a little differently. It's like Courtenay, Courtenay Substack, and it is up on there. I've already outlined 7 more chapters. I'm hoping in the next few months to be able to get it out, and I do think I'm going to be self-publishing, so I'm looking into doing a pre-order option. So that being said, I start out by outlining some of the ancient mystery cults, and they have nuanced differences, but ultimately they do tend to take on a what I call little g Gnostic framework. And I say little g because it is, slight variations, of the Gnostic um, premise, which for those who are not familiar, the Gnostics were a specific group that were considered Christian heretics in the first century. For first to third century, I would say, there was a span of time, but essentially they believed that here on earth was created by an ignorant demiurge who withheld knowledge and limited man's capacity, and that it was Lucifer, the light bearer, who would illuminate. Right, he would illuminate and provide the gnosis, which is that in Greek the hidden knowledge, right? And through that, that mankind could ascend and essentially become their own gods. They could become gods through this knowledge, this hidden gnosis. And so, therefore, Lucifer, the light bearer, was really the true benevolent God. And so, this is an inversion, obviously, of the Judeo Christian biblical premise that we see in the Old Testament. They're really turning to the serpent as being the the good guy, if you will. And so I see all of these various little ancient mystery cults as kind of iterations, little g Gnostic little g Gnosticism variants of this, more well-known capital G Gnostic premise. But they share some common themes. So one of the shared themes is that they have different terms, but they'll talk about things like the divine spark. Right, it's a pantheistic or panentheistic. The pantheistic is the notion of multiple gods or God everywhere, or panentheistic, which is this notion that God is within each of us. So essentially, we are all God or have the chance to become God. The other common theme I see between all of them is that they talk about how we come from the one. The ancient Greeks would have referred to it as the undifferentiated all. The Theosophists, of course, call it source, and they talk about the journey of humanity is to return to source, return to the undifferentiated all. So this battle between the one and the many, and the one is better to them than the many. The other common theme with all of these ancient mystery cults is that you have either a trauma induction or a drug induced transcendent experience.
Like
And
the
of course,
psychedelics, right?
hmm?
All the psychedelics.
Yes, psychedelics.
Yeah.
And they have different variations, but we certainly see a lot of like the indigenous groups where they have a shaman who will lead them to have take some variation of psychedelics, and then they have this awakening experience, is what they call it, but it's transcendent, right? They suddenly realize they have an epiphany that all is one, and that they are God, and that seems to be a very common theme. But there is also history of trauma, right? You through trauma they have transcendence, and there's this, I think, is laid the groundwork for what we see today as trauma-based mind control. And this is another way that they create trauma bonding to do away with any kind of boundaries, so that there's a, a blurring of boundaries. There's no distinction between you or I, the one, the many, right? It just becomes all the one. And I think we see a lot of this in modern culture today, where they're trying to do away with boundaries. I think one of the kind of more overt ones of recently is this notion that there's not male, female. There's all these genders. I think that they said there was something like 181, or who knows what they're up to
Yeah.
now.
Mhm.
But this is to do away with the distinction of boundaries and of differentiality. And this does harken back to these ancient mystery cults, right, where they worship things like the hermaphrodite, and they worship these various figures, and each one had their own version of it, but it was a uh, typically a hermaphroditic type of a being that they were worshiping, which is, again, it's the blurring of the boundaries and the uniting. There's another theme that I point out, is this polarity of opposites and creating unity. This is the Hegelian synthesis of those opposites. And we see this often with like, Nietzschean kind of terms, beyond good and evil, right? There's
Mhm.
no separate distinction of good versus evil. They're not separate entities. They are unity of opposites. And the goal is to combine them to create a transcendence, to go beyond good and evil. So those are some of the common themes that I see throughout. And if we talk about some very prominent figures, I think Plato and Aristotle kind of signify at least in the West, I think the battle for the soul. And I think that they both actually had quite valid points. I know there's a lot of academic polarity.
Mhm.
You're either in favor of Aristotle or you're in favor of Plato. I don't see it quite that. Um, I don't see. I see that as a false dialectic, to be really honest. And I think what's happened is that the Neoplatonists subverted both of them, and the Neoplatonists were very inspired by a lot of these ancient mystery cults, particularly the ancient Egyptian cults. The Thoth, that, right? Trismegistus was a
Mhm.
combination of Thoth and Hermes.
Yeah.
And I think that they were very inspired by the ancient Egyptian pantheistic religion, pagan religion. They were also very inspired by Pythagoras, who I refer to as, who I think today he would have been kind of like a modern, like, rock guru.
Mhm.
He was a musician, but he was, of course, a mathematician as well. And music is very mathematical. That's where we get a lot of these harmonic resonances. There's a very, when you study music, there's a music theory. There's a lot of formulaic, mathematical um, r- resonance. And he was one, of course, anyone who's taken geometry will remember the Pythagorean theorem. But I think a lot of what he brought was, it was very much an ancient mystery cult that you had to be initiated into. And so of course they were both inspired by, definitely Plato is very inspired by a lot of these ancient mystery cults. And then you get the Neoplatonists, who took elements, they kind of cherry picked, but again they were hearkening back to a more pagan and pantheistic viewpoint. I'm
Mhm.
trying to simplify all of
Yeah.
this. It's really
Thank you.
just, cliff notes, brush strokes.
Yes.
But they were the impetus for the Theosophists. And so this is much more recent, right? So we
So
go
you
throughout.
see a direct connection between the Neoplatonist and the Theosophic, Madame Blavatsky, and Alice Bailey, and all those.
Absolutely. And they say it, so this isn't my inference. This is not speculation. They directly cite the works of people like Plotinus or Origen, and they cite them as the inspiration for this theosophical worldview. They call it a perennial religion. And they say, that it's they accept all faiths, but except they reject monotheistic faiths. So they very much are diametrically opposed to traditional Judaism and traditional Christianity, and even traditional Muslim faiths, because it's monotheistic. So they're very welcoming of the more Kabbalistic variations of those religions, which are the mystical that do combine a more pantheistic kind of a reference rather than the traditional biblical framework.
Mhm. Yes.
So yeah.
Okay.
But the throughout, there are many, I think, philosophers who have taken this path, where it looks like, I would say, in the, again, this is not, I'm just trying to think how far back we want to go, but I would say Descartes really kind of was a very pivotal
Mhm.
figure in that he, the famous cogito ergo sum, right? I
Yes.
think, therefore I am. This is the first principle of Hermeticism. This is mentalism. Mentalism is very influential, obviously, on the Theosophists, and then the new iteration of Theosophy is called New Thought, and they put a very strong focus on mentalism. This is this notion that all is in the mind, that we can project through our mental energy. They say where energy goes, things flow, everything follows. So they put a very strong emphasis on this mental focus and vision, so you can create, right? The book The Secret really popularized
Mhm.
these ideas.
Yes. So it's
So
basically the primacy of consciousness against the primacy of existence, right?
yes,
Those are the two philosophies that are fighting here. A-
yes, that's
And and
exactly right.
and it seems like they want to have the primacy of consciousness because then they can just create anything they want without any limitation. They are not bound by the world, by the natural world, or by anything, right? They break free and then they can do as they want,
And
un-
they can be
unconstrained,
God, right?
become
They can
gods.
be
Yes.
God. Exactly. Because it's not rooted in reality. And so therefore they can make up whatever they want to make up. And they can convince you that it's real because it's not rooted in anything of substance.
So we are basically dealing with wizards, and we are like stuck in some kind of a pseudo reality, right? Hyper or secondary reality, right?
That's exactly right.
And
And
that
the
will
wizards
connect us to Hegel, which is
the ultimate wizard.
yes.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And so many are familiar with Hegel. They've heard the term Hegelian dialectic. Hegel certainly was not the first to use the term dialectic, or to even use it as a framework. I would say that throughout history, I think dialectics are just inherent. I think that part is actually accurate. They are inherent, but they are also a very useful tool to weaponize, and for means of control and social engineering. And I think that people have recognized this since the beginning of humankind. And Hegel was he's often attributed to saying thesis, antithesis, synthesis. He
Oh, that's
actually never
Fichte,
used.
no? I think it's Fichte who coined the thesis,
Yes,
antithesis, and synthesis.
it is Fichte. Yeah,
Yeah, I think Hegel was using it in a different way. It was like abstract and negation and concrete.
that's
Uh,
correct.
yeah,
Yeah.
so sorry,
So
go ahead.
Fichte, yeah, no, that's great. Fichte was adopting that was his interpretation of Kant's dialectic. And Hegel actually specifically rejected both Kant and Plato's notion of the dialectic. He felt that they were too abstract and too intellectual. And
Mhm.
he doesn't use these terms. Obviously, he wrote in German, so he wasn't using English at all. But what he alludes to is that he was looking for a, a system, a methodology that would advance the historicity of man. And so he didn't want something that was abstract and intellectual. He wanted something that could be used and systematized, an operating system, essentially. And so that's why he rejected both Kant and Plato's notion of the dialectic. But Fichte was interpreting Kant's dialectic as being thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which isn't quite accurate either. And then it was Schallibaus. I don't think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, so I apologize for that. But he considered himself a Hegel scholar, and he popularized this notion of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis that he got really from reading Fichte. And Fichte was an interesting character. He was very close with Pestalozzi. Pestalozzi was an official Illuminati member. That's that's mainline history. That's not speculation or conspiracy theory. That's just mainline history. And he was a very prominent figure in the field of education. He had a lot of ideas on education, and Fichte, and they were pretty radical. And Fichte actually went a step further and said that the state should be in charge of education, and it should be a way of putting children in the hands of the state versus the family. And so he popularized Pestalozzi's ideas and then took them further. And Fichte was very involved in those circles, the kind of esoteric, mystical circles through his friend Pestalozzi. And but when we get to Hegel, and Hegel was also very influenced by Fichte as well. But Hegel's notion of the dialectic, as you mentioned, was the abstract, negative, concrete, and in that is, of course, this concept of Aufheben. And in German, Aufheben is this very oxymoronic kind of a term that means to lift up and preserve while simultaneously tearing down and canceling. And this is,
It's insane. It's insane. I don't. It's in English. It's sublation, right?
yes, it is sublation, but it is even more nuanced than sublation, because people typically think of sublation as to wipe out and cancel. So it leaves out this shell of the preservation, right? That you still have this because they lift it up and they preserve it, and it's really that shell, but it's hollowed out because that's the sublation. So it is a very English has a lot of words that are it's like we have more specific words, but we don't have words that encompass a lot of connotation.
But what
Yeah.
Hegel means exactly when he speaks about abstract, negative, and concrete? Can you give an example for that, please?
Yeah, so it is very similar to this thesis, antithesis, synthesis kind of a concept, but it's much more nuanced, because he's talking about how you have the abstract. So this is the idea, right? So thesis, I guess it's a more reductionistic way of saying it, but it's a notion. It's something that emerges. And then you have the negative. It's something. It's the counter that wipes that out, and then from there, it's the concretization. And the concretization is this synthetic emergence from those two. But this is why Aufheben is so important. And, in my book, I talk about the Theodorus spiral that the Pythagoreans, I think they worship the Theodorus spiral. But that's kind of just my theory. But I think it's why the number 17 is so prevalent everywhere. Like the 17 Sustainable Development
Yeah.
Goals, Q was 17. I think there's a lot of references to 17, but that's where the Theodorus spiral eclipses. And so essentially I see it as the Aufheben rung on what I call the Gnostic Jacob's ladder. And I do see Hegel's dialectic as a Gnostic Jacob's ladder, hence the title of the book. So this is the inversion of the Jacob's ladder story from Genesis. And this is the Gnostic premise that man is going to be the one to evolve history towards what Hegel called the rational absolute. But Hegel himself actually talked about the rational as being speculative. That's the English translation. It's speculative. And he himself says that speculative is no different than mystical. So I think it really is written in very Aesopian language, where it's meant to the uninitiated to appear as a very logical, rational, to use that term, kind of intellectual process. when
Hmm.
for those who are initiated, they understand the esoteric messaging, which signals that this is really it's a cryptic code for the evolution, the ascension of man towards the rational absolute, which is this that the Geist becomes one. It's the collective. And he does say that the state is God, essentially, right? Man becomes the state collectively, and that
Yeah.
is God. And he talks about freedom also. He says that humans cannot achieve any freedom without complete subservience to the state. So essentially, we have to, do away with all of our individuality to become part of the one, and that is the manifestation of God here on earth. So the
So
Alchemy are the various rungs on that ladder where we do away with these various ideas, the abstract, the concrete, and then it becomes this new variation, which is a simulacra of the two that merged,
mhm.
and you go up this, you ascend that Gnostic Jacob's ladder.
So this is a perfect example for a weaponized philosophy, basically just to put us all under the tyrannical state and
Yes.
surrender and give us the freedom to surrender all our rights to the sovereign, right?
And that is very much how I see it. Now, I will just preface: I don't think everybody who subscribes to this is inherently evil or malevolent or even trying to control us. I think that there are people who genuinely believe it. Just like the Gnostics, there are many who believe that that is the good path. They believe that really we have all been deceived, and this is the gnosis that's going to free us. So I just want to preface it that way. However, unfortunately, the result is then we are, we become stripped of our free will. We become stripped of our individuality, and this becomes the reality that manifests is a tyrannical regime. So yeah.
So maybe you can speak about specific examples of this synthesis, this dialectic, because I see it, for example, in the destruction of capitalism and socialism together and creating the third way, which is like some kind of new technocratic fascism. I can see it, especially now with Trump, who is surrounded by technocratic. How to say it, like the elite technocratic people of today's world. And I was wondering, what do you think about it? Because it seems like they are using those two ideological systems and eventually create the third way, which is fascism. It's the unholy connection, unholy marriage between public and private. How do you see it?
I couldn't agree more. And we have the futures. I always love to say, it's easy to predict the future when you plan it. So they always seem to know it's coming. But people like Brzezinski and Kissinger, and they very much outlined this. They said that they would create a hegemonic battles between the East and the West, and the philosophies and ideologies of the East and the West, or the capitalist versus the communist, and that those battles would allow for the emergence, the Hegelian emergence. They didn't say that, but that's essentially what they were, inferring, is this Hegelian emergence of the technocratic era, right? That's literally what they laid out. And I think that's very much what we're seeing. I do think Trump, whether wittingly or unwittingly, I'm not privy to those details. I don't know him personally, but I do see that he is surrounded by these technocratic elite. Most of Silicon Valley seems to be somehow connected to the current administration, and they do seem to be rolling out this technate, and they're creating these regionalized poles. So a lot of people talk about multipolarity. I think it's a very deceptive term. It seems to imply the notion that we're going to have competing poles, but ultimately it is the conduit to create this, centralized technocratic regime. And it's the dissolution of nation states. That's really what it's about. So when you have the Technocracy Inc. had talked about this, right? They had the Technate that they said was going to be essentially this North American Union, and now we hear these talks of Greenland and Canada being acquired. Of course, then it would also be Mexico, and this would be this North American Union that would be the Technate. And then they talked about these other regions, these other regionalized areas, and we saw the exact same map laid out in the Club of Rome's 1973 document, Regionalized and Adaptive Globalization. So we saw those same poles being laid out. This is the same kind of structures that Brzezinski, Kissinger, Attali had talked about. And I think the Bible even references these 10 poles and these 10 regions. I don't know if they mapped out the exact, I haven't seen the map of it, but it seems to be very similar. So that to say, I don't know if this is an inevitable kind of a plan that's being worked out, but I do see that the concern is that inherent in that is this dissolution of nation states, which I think is a bulwark against centralized tyranny. And I think it is a way that we can preserve our individual sovereignty is through these through national sovereignty. So it is quite concerning, and I do see that as a dialectic, right? We're constantly battling. Is it the capitalists versus the communists, and then we see these mergers, these fascistic mergers. But I think China is a really good example of that fascistic merger. And I keep hearing, oh, China has so much capitalism, but they really don't. They're a surveillance state. And everything really is. They may have some entrepreneurialism within that, but it is a surveillance state, and it really is a very, very much, I think, a blueprint for the technocracy that they want to roll out. And if you read the blueprint for the AI world society, they say that, they keep referencing China as the model, and they'll change the names, right? So they, instead of saying a social credit system, they'll say social value reward system, which sounds so much nicer. It sounds meritocratic, but it really is the same type of thing. So yeah, so I would
What
agree with you.
what is the role of BRICS? And also, there is some kind of revival of nationalistic sentiment. For example, in
Mhm.
Argentina, you suddenly see Milei, Javier Milei, and it seems like he's very much against the UN and all this globalization. And Trump seems to be the same, but we already said that he is surrounded by technocratic elite. How do you position all of that? Like, BRICS and the West, is that part of the dialectic?
I think it very much is. I think it's absolutely part of the dialectic. I think that BRICS is to create a stronger hegemonic battle between the East and the West, and so then they will ultimately try and emerge with some sort of a synthetic centralization. I'm also concerned about here in the West, where, obviously Trump has to declare this executive order where he says that he's going to ban CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies. But again, I see a kind of Hegelian pole emerging where you hear a lot of discussion about other types of coins, right? Other types of digital currency that might emerge where they're against the centralized digital currency, but they're in favor of these other types of stable coins. And what I think they're pitting against each other, to use the Hegelian reference, is these authoritarian, top-down, centralized digital currency, that the UN, the central banks will be implementing, versus the the term they keep using is decentralized. But my concern is that, and I think it's because it's going to be more likely that the West would acquiesce to something that sounds decentralized, where they have, decentralized autonomous organizations, the DAOs that they keep talking about. But I think that it's very deceptive. It's just a marketing term for people who are resistant to a authoritarian centralized power. And what it will really look like in reality, in practicality, is the decentralization that will lead to the world brain, as H.G. Wells discussed. H.G. Wells talked about in his book, The World Brain, that the decentralization of the information institutions, which of course, in his day, he was talking about like the academic institutions. But today, what are the information institutions? They are the internet, right? It's
Mhm.
technology. And so I'm very concerned that they're giving people the illusion of these decentralizations and these decentralized options, decentralized finance, decentralized apps, and that ultimately it will be the conduit to create that world brain through this dialectical battle.
So the world brain is back to the mind of the Gnosis, right? It's the Hermetic God, right? That's how they are going to.
Yeah.
It's so scary.
I think it's terrifying. And we see it's like it's always just another iteration of the same thing. So I feel like, you can go through all of these. People will always argue the nuance game with me. And I feel like the nuance game is the ultimate critical theory, right? It's just
Mhm.
we're just gonna which I think Descartes really paved the way for all this. It's just the constant skeptic, but not rooted in reality, right? Uh, there's no concrete grounding for it. It's just constant doubt. And I always have this argument from these skeptics, these critical theorists who will tell me, well, but they're not all the same. And this is true. They do have nuanced differences. And of course, they have battles within. And sometimes I think they're Hegelian theater. It's battles for ostensible battles, but they're ultimately, playing two sides of the same coin. We have this all the time, but they will constantly tell me that they're different. And I said, yes, and we can point to the various nuances, but ultimately, what they share in common is much more concerning to me. And what they share in common is this vision of collectivism, this vision of eradicating the notion of the sanctity of the individual and free will. And the modern variations of this that we're seeing from, I would call them the new thought, right? But it's all coming out of the same theosophical soup. And the biggest concern I have with them is that they're derived from these same philosophies, and they'll reference these philosophers. I was listening to a podcast not too long ago where they were talking about how these people in this space keep talking about how they owe so much to Spinoza. I'm like, really? We're going to publicly say this, but most people haven't studied philosophy, so they don't understand, the potential dangers of that. But what my biggest concern is that now they're not just advocating for a spiritual evolution that will guide us towards the oneness, as they call it. But they're also talking about using technology, which will which will potentially force us towards that, and that's very concerning to me. So,
So it's basically having Blavatsky on steroids with AI, something like that.
mm-hmm.
So how do you actually see the connection between the theosophical philosophy and what's happening to us with the AI and this beehive of mind? Like, why are they putting so much focus on one world religion while they already have us, sorry, pardon my French, by the balls with this technocratic approach?
I think for a couple of reasons. So I did a show and I called it the technological immanentization of the escaton,
Mm.
and I that's I feel like it sums it up because this is really to me the crux of the battle. I think we have the people who value free will, and regardless of their religious beliefs, they subscribe to some notion of there being a benevolent, divine creator, rational, benevolent, loving creator that we are made in the image of, and that has created, all things here on earth, and that there's no perfection here on earth. The humans are flawed inherently, and that there possibly we can do our best here through our gift of free will to aspire towards virtue, morality, and then maybe in the afterlife we can see some sort of a perfect realm. And then the people who believe that there was a you could say evil demiurge, or the literal terms they used were they use the ignorant, right? It was done through ignorance. And so, of course, we're trapped here in this space by this ignorant demiurge that limited our abilities and our knowledge and our capacity, and that it is our duty to unlock that knowledge to become the Ubermensch, essentially, right? Nietzschean Ubermensch. And so through that, we can create perfection here on earth. And I think that's exactly what you're seeing. So you're seeing these people who believe that through this synthetic kind of emergence, right? The technological, synthetic biology, I don't really believe that AI is going to achieve sentience, but I think that they will try to convince people. I'm seeing that they've already tried to convince many that it actually has already occurred, and I don't believe that. But I think that the potential ramifications of just people believing that, whether or not it's actually been achieved, is very, very pernicious. And so those people want to create heaven on earth. And they're in order to do that, so they could just do that with so I think, as I said, I think there are a couple of things going on and a couple of reasons. So theoretically, they could just, terraform everything and just create their synthetic heaven perfection here on earth and through all their technology. But then they wouldn't have this opt-in system, right? It would be done through force. And I think that if you're looking at it from a biblical framework, there's God wants to be chosen. That's why he gave you the gift of free will,
Hmm.
right? So he's hoping that you will do good and choose him. But Satan, or Lucifer, wants to be chosen also. And
Yeah.
that's why oftentimes it is an opt-in. So it's not done through force. And we saw this, I think over the past few years, right? There's all these, you're given these very difficult choices, but ultimately you opt into your own tyranny. So I think that's one thing. I think that's one element of what's going on. But I think there's also, through the philosophical framework, they're able to convince you that we're already part of a collective consciousness, that we're already one. So what difference does it make if we, use technology just to enhance it and make that experience better and elevate the oneness? Right. So I think that that's a huge part of it as well. And they are trying to create a one world religion. We see this through organizations like the UN. And I think that it's very instrumental because if I was listening to Robert, I'll just use an example to maybe make this really tangible for people.
Hmm.
I was listening to Robert Mueller the other day, and it was a video from well over a decade ago, maybe longer. It was uploaded a decade ago. But he was talking about, he worked for the UN as Secretary General for 40 years. He's responsible for bringing the World Core curriculum, known as Common Core in the United States. But this is, his vision of how to uh,
Create a
realize.
global citizen, no?
Hmm?
To create a global citizen eventually, a dumbed down
Exactly.
version of that.
Yes, but it
Hmm.
was it was inspired by Alice Bailey, right? The New Age in religion. So we could bring the externalization of the hierarchy through education, and yes, to create the global citizen, create the global workforce and be cogs in the technological machine. So, but he was talking about the success of the UN, and it was really interesting to listen to because he was talking about the success of the UN with, of course, their goal is peace and how everybody has to get along. And the little sidebar was that the United States, if they don't want to play ball, they're just going to be left behind because now there are other options. You'll have all these, regionalized conglomerates, and the United States will be left out. But what struck me was how he kept talking about how with this goal of peace, there has to be collectivism, there has to be collaboration and cooperation. And that's why they have to eradicate free will. Because if you have people who have different opinions, different ideas, different cultures, different religions, different worldviews, different visions, right? Two people can have a vision of what is heaven for them, right? What is going to be, ideal for them, and they could look radically different. And for one person, that person's vision of perfection could look like hell to somebody else, and vice versa. And
Yeah.
so you have to get rid of those differences in order to create the peace, because those differences create conflict and tension. I'm not saying it has to, result in violence. I think there are ways to deal with differences and tension, but I think essentially that's why they're so hell bent on bringing this collective unity and this one world religion, because it's a way of steering everybody towards this global governance.
Mhm. I understand. I would like to go back for a second when
Mhm.
you spoke about the cryptocurrency and the decentralization, and Trump goes against the CBDC. In the same way, I think he's doing the same thing in education, right? He's like decentralizing it, but he's putting it in the hands of private companies that are getting the money from the government. Can you speak a little about that? If
Yeah, so he wants to nationalize school choice. And I get a lot of pushback with school choice because it sounds wonderful, right? Again, this is such clever marketing. Who's going to argue against choice and options? But that is really not what this is about. This is about government school choice. We know whatever the government funds, it runs. This is about having complete control of education be determined by the government, and then ultimately by supranational organizations, because it's going to be run through these public-private partnerships who are incentivized to prioritize profit over individual children's educations. And this is very, very concerning to me. He has talked about, he's giving a lot of lip service to things that people want to hear. A lot of people in the who may have voted for him, or Republicans or libertarian conservatives alike. They love to hear that we're going to dismantle this bloated apparatus of the Department of Education. But he has said that he is going to put a lot of these, he's going to get rid of the people who are not doing their job, right? So that does not mean that he's getting rid of everybody. He's going to put a lot of them into other organizations like the Department of Health, the Department of Labor. So these same figures are still going to be working in this arena. And now we are going to have these vouchers and this school choice options where the government will be paying for various it's going to be, a range of things, but you're going to see a rise of these public-private partnerships, which ultimately will create a supranational. I think the best way I could explain it is you go back a few years ago. I'll be careful with how I word this, but you go back a few years ago, and if you, had certain personal views on what you wanted to do with your body and with your face, and you went into a local kind of mom and pop store, likely that the owners of that store may, either negotiate with you, or they would, have their own views on how to operate and what was allowed. You went into a big box store, right, which is mega corporation. They're supranational entities, right, because they work internationally and they agree on things internationally. So their policies tend to be international, and oftentimes those international policies are subject to and trying to win the favor of organizations like the UN, the World Economic Forum, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the DEI, the ESG. And so in order to score those points, they were more likely to abide by these very tyrannical measures. So even if your local town said, you do what you want with your body for your health, we respect that. You went into a store, big box store, and they said, no, this is what you have to do. And that's what you'll see in education. So, you may decide as a parent that you want to follow a specific curriculum, or that your child should not take certain drugs. And they will say, well, we have this, curriculum done by this organization. You have to follow. We have this testing done by this organization. We have this mental health counselor and this, health provider. And these are all of our partnerships. And so you are subject to their policies.
Mhm.
And so now you see how this can follow the
It's
child.
really funny that the conservative and the libertarians thinking that they have more freedom, and they forget that the government is paying with money that is stolen from the people by taxation, right?
Yep.
There is no free market here. There is no nothing. They steal the money from the civilians and they give it to their friends in the corporation world. And actually, they are just utilizing it better because public corporations work better than the government. So now they can do data mining to the children and condition them even faster and better.
That's
Wouldn't you
absolutely
agree?
right. And that is what it's all about. It's all about data mining the children so they can create cybernetic feedback loops. So they will data mine the children, and then through the cybernetic feedback loops, they will be able to program the children. So we've seen years and years of this education system that's been exported, the Prussian model of education, which was literally based on the Battle of Jena in the Napoleonic War, where the soldiers rebelled, and they determined that the soldiers rebelled because they were critical, independent thinkers, and they couldn't have that. So they designed a model of education to breed compliance and obedience. And that is what they exported, through the Leipzig connection, the Wilhelm Wundt, right, of the late 1800s, who we have his disciples like Dewey and Pavlov, and we've got I'm blanking on all the names, but these very it was like the Skinnerian Pavlovian model, because Wilhelm Wundt was actually a Hegelian. He believed that human beings were devoid of a soul. And so therefore it was fine to use these behavioral, kind of like you would train a dog, a Pavlovian or a Skinnerian type of a model to teach and train children and humans. And so these disciples, of course, like Dewey and Horace Mann, brought this to the United States. And in partnership, a really great resource on this would be Charlotte Iserbyt, who wrote The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, John Taylor Gatto, and also Anthony Sutton did some great work on the Order of Skull and Bones and how they controlled the education system. And we saw that through these, various academic institutions that were created, Johns Hopkins, Yale. We had the Morrill land grab. It was the Morrill grant, which was, through the guise of education, putting land ownership under government purview. And this was a really, really destructive way of breeding out critical thinking and also rationality, and not rationality in this collective mystical sense, but in the sense of, being grounded in the scientific method with empirical evidence of what is true and what is real. And so now we have this new system, and it's designed to breed all of that and eradicate all of that from children's development, and to create mindless, obedient soldiers. So, and Charlotte Iserbyt actually warned us in the 80s. She was a whistleblower on the BEST project under the Reagan administration. And the BEST was this tech ed that we're seeing today. But she had warned that this school choice initiative would be pushed through the right wing politically, that it would have gotten too much pushback otherwise. And so, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit for the sake of my audience here in Israel, like how the data mining and this conditioning is taking place. Like how does it actually look like? If you can give us a little more details.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are many, many like specific programs, and I've done several shows going through that, but for the sake of time, just think about how education works today. If you generations ago, you had a teacher, like if you went to school, you had a teacher, you had some books, and everything was analog. Now, today, almost everything is done through a computer or an iPad, some sort of technological interface. So that alone is creating a cybernetic feedback loop, right? They're already taking information from the children, and then through algorithms, they're now using feedback loops to program them. And of course, this is done under the guise that they're, they're tracking what their strengths are. They're figuring out how they learn, what things they're like. You take a math course, for example, and they're now learning what they did well, how they answered those questions, and they're fine tuning it. Right? They call it precision AI education. So it's always couched in this that it's going to be helpful, and it's tailored specifically towards them. But we see these, like there's an offshoot of heart math, which is these wearables that the children have that's supposed to help them focus and be more essentially compliant, but that there it's they frame it that it's going to help them to focus and increase their cognitive retention. And this is again, like they're literally collecting biometric data from the children, and they're able to use that to then, I mean, it's like, I don't know if you're familiar with something like heart math, and it's used to they track the brainwave states, and they can help you with meditating to relax and reduce anxiety and that sort of thing. But if it can track that, this is literally what Technocracy Inc. said, that all means of data collection were for control. And so if they can track all of this, they can also use it to program and to control. I mean, those are a couple of examples, but it's all this technology that they're using, and it's always marketed as being helpful, that this is now tailored towards the child. But of course, if it's tailored towards the child, it's also able to program them, and we know what their ultimate agenda is. That's not to say that technology can't ever be helpful. I'm not a Luddite. I'm not advocating that we eradicate all technology, but I do think we need to be cautious and aware of what the concerns may be, who's programming them, what are their agendas, what are their worldviews, and especially when it comes to children education. And then there's just, I mean, even the more obvious kinds of concerns, like it's not good for children to be staring at a screen all day, right? That's not how we're designed as humans. It's hard for adults, but certainly for developing brains, we already know all the detriments of things like the blue light, and what that does to increase things like ADD and other kinds of neurodivergent behaviors.
Actually, it's very unhealthy for children to be away from their parents and loved ones and to be stuck in this Prussian jail, right? Never
Yeah,
mind technology or not.
we could
Yeah,
start with that. Yeah, for sure.
yeah. And that's more gifts that we got from the Prussians, right? It's back to
Yeah.
Fichte.
Yep.
He is the one who devised the Prussian public education system, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken. And
Yep.
he's a Freemason, right? Just as a by.
So yeah, Fico was a Freemason, and he had relations with Illuminati members. I can't find any direct evidence that he was an official Illuminati, but he was definitely close to Pestalozzi, who absolutely was. Pestalozzi's code name, I believe, was Alfred.
Mhm. I would like to go back now to the Theosophical
Mhm.
philosophy. Why is it that it's so helpful for them to combine a lot of elements from the how do you call it, East mystical elements from the East, from India and Tibet and stuff like that? Because today in Israel, you would see people all the time exercising yoga, very
Mhm.
busy with meditation. They're trying to find answers in their stomach. What's all about that? Like, what's going on with this push of the East narrative?
So I will start by saying that if I were, from one of these Eastern uh, regions, and I subscribe to something like Hinduism or Buddhism, I would actually be very offended, because what they do is they cherry pick. So they're not maintaining the integrity of these Eastern religions. They're cherry picking aspects of it that serve their purposes and that serve their telos. So
Mhm.
I'll just start by saying that. But I think that it's very amenable to these, theosophical collectivist types of mindsets, because they don't necessarily subscribe to a individual type of a god. It's not a monistic type of faith. So that is much more amenable to these theosophical, Neoplatonic kind of renditions. And so I think that's firstly, but I think also they tend to favor this unity. A lot of them talk about, right, achieving nirvana is a collective unity. And so I think that that's largely why. And then, yeah, people are searching, right? So they're searching for answers. We Because we are limited, and because we can't know everything, we're curious, we're trying to figure things out. And so we have to, in order to function, we have to operate on an element of faith. So all humans subscribe to faith of some sort. whether they admit it or not. We just do in order to function. So that faith, and for some people, may be science, but I would argue it's scientism. It's not the scientific method. And so I think that's why the Eastern religions tend to be so appealing for the Theosophists.
Mhm. I sent the World Invocation Day prayer to some Christian friends that I have, and I asked them, "What do you make of it?" And they said, "That's an amazing prayer, so beautiful." And of course, it belongs to, I don't know, Lord Maitreya or whatever.
Mhm.
How do we help Christians or Jewish to recognize the dangers in this narrative, in these prayers? Like, what are the elements that we should be aware of and be careful from?
Oh, I'm trying so hard. Um, it's so it's very, very difficult. I think it's intentional, right? It's
Yeah.
very deceptive. They speak in what I call Christianese, right? They
Yes.
talk about things like Christ consciousness, which sounds
Mhm.
Christian. It's not. So for all the Christians out there listening, they specifically say in their writing they're not talking about Jesus Christ. They're talking about Christ, the figure who is no different than any other world teacher, Lord Maitreya. Lord Maitreya, by the way, is Antichrist, but they say it's a world teacher, and they say there's no difference from Buddha, Krishna, or any of these other world teachers, as they call them. So that's first and foremost. It's they're not referring to Jesus Christ. So, but they do use these Christian terms, and I think it is very, very deceptive. But World Invocation Day, yeah. So just look at their language. They this is the
Light, love, all the time, light and love. I think as soon as I see light, enlightenment, I'm like worried, very
yes.
worried.
Well, light and love, right? The light is the light bearer, right?
Yes,
This is Lucius Trust was originally Lucifer
Lucifer.
Publishing.
Yes.
Alice Bailey had Lucifer magazine, and they say that even on their own. You can go right to Trust website, right, and they see this of their own worth, and they say that people are very confused and it's misleading because they talk about Lucifer, and the people don't understand Lucifer's a light bearer, but they literally say they are referring to Lucifer. So I don't
Mhm.
think people are. I always want to say no. We're not confused. We understand. You're talking about Lucifer. You just see Lucifer as the one who will illuminate humanity. So they see Lucifer as the true God. And Alice Bailey says that this is one of the reasons why she's diametrically opposed to Judaism, traditional Judaism, and Christianity, because they don't understand that Satan and Lucifer are the true God. There's a literal quote from her where she says that, and she says it multiple times. It's not a one-off kind of thing. So, how do people understand that when they talk about the plan of love and light work out? They're talking about to work out the goodwill servers, right? So that we will all become part of this collective unity. They're not talking about. It sounds great, love and light, but
Yes.
they're talking about creating this unity of the one. This is not referencing anything that looks remotely like traditional Christianity, or even comporting with Judaism. So
I wonder, I'm secular.
Mhm,
Do you honestly believe that all those people, the puppet master, let's call them,
mhm.
who are using these religious philosophies and all the things that you mentioned, do they actually believe in Satan or the devil or something like that? Or are they just taking advantage of these religious systems and the beliefs of people and subvert it and infiltrate it and use it basically to bring them into some kind of a tyrannical world?
I think it's a combination, quite honestly. I think some of them may really believe that Lucifer is the true benevolent God who's going to illuminate all of humanity, and that we must unite to become part of this, to create a noosphere, the singularity. I think some of them genuinely believe it. I think a lot of them use it as a blueprint. They use it as a tool to manipulate and socially engineer the masses.
I understand. Can you please explain to my audience about what is the network state concept? please.
Yes, so I'm very concerned about this network state. The network state is a term that was coined based on a book written by Balaji Srinivasan, and he was the former CTO of Coinbase, and it was based on the concept of seasteading. And this was something that Peter Thiel was very heavily invested in. He had invested, I believe, $1.7 million. That's the figure I saw into this concept of seasteading, and it didn't pan out. And so he's now channeled a lot of his energies towards this network state concept. And the very elevator pitch, Cliff Notes version of what it is a dissolution of geographical nation states in favor of these cyber ideological network states. So you will have these various, platforms that will be the conduit for uh, your vegan network state or your, hyper libertarian network state. I'm just throwing things out, but so
Yes.
these kind of ideas where people seem to be aligned, and you will still need some sort of a digital ID, digital passport to enter. You will still need some sort of digital currencies. You will have some sort of a social credit system, regardless of whether or not they call it that. But I'm pretty sure if you are a member of this vegan network state and they discover that you went out to dinner at a steakhouse and had
That's
a
it.
ribeye,
Yeah.
you might no longer be welcome in your network state, and you will find your funds and your ID are all rescinded and shut down. So these network states, I think, are very I'm very concerned about them. I think that they're very deceptive because they're being marketed as decentralized, freedom oriented, and of course catering to your proclivities. But this is really communitarianism, which it can be just as tyrannical. So
Hmm. What do you make any sense of everything that is happening in my region? Like, how do we play into this game of geopolitical conflict? Do you have
uh,
any insights into that?
I do. I do. I tend to not love to discuss the topic because I do think it is created for the purposes of Hegelian polarization. But the way I see it is that I do really think that um, there's a greater Israel project that has nothing to do with the Jews. They're using the Jews as a scapegoat, and as agitprop, essentially. Unfortunately, they're using it as a way to create dialectical tensions. But I think that there is a plan for. They call it the Greater Israel Project, but I believe it's really a Greater Babylonian Project. And if you look at the map of Babylon, it comports with that, and it's the same region. And I think that they want to use the Jews as an excuse to create this region that is really for their Luciferian, to recreate the Babylonian Empire. And that's not to say that I think that the Jews shouldn't have a place. That
Yes.
I think the two are completely separate issues, but they're using it because they can play on people's very deep passionate sensibilities. And obviously it's a way of creating heightened tensions. But I don't even like to use the term Zionism, because the word itself was created to create dialectical poles. It was coined by someone who hated Jews. So
I
yeah,
agree. Yes. So I guess the Jews, the Israelis, are going to be expendable again in this kind of scenario that will play out
I'm
as
really
usual.
hoping not, but that is what I see. That's Henry Kissinger himself said, this was over 10 years ago. They asked, what do you see of Israel in the next decade? And he said that it'll be wiped off the face of the map.
Yeah, the
I
experiment
don't think
is.
those were his exact words, but essentially he said it would cease to exist. So that's, yeah.
Well, this time I hope you're wrong, but
I
we'll
hope
see.
so too.
Yeah.
I'm merely speaking to what I think the plans are and
Yes.
what the intentions of some of these people may be. But yeah, I'm really hoping to be very, very wrong. And I, to their credit, they're obviously some of the most resilient people. So hopefully they the testament of free will prevail. So
Yeah. What's going on with the climate change hoax, Agenda 2030, the big celebration of 2045 with the 100-year celebration of the UN?
oh,
Like,
yeah.
what are the surprises that you see that are awaiting us?
Well, they have been using this climate hoax, the Gaia religion, as I call it, for a very long time as a means for implementing a lot of these tyrannical measures and policies and for confiscating our rights, our freedoms, and our ownership of property. They've been doing, so we can own nothing and be happy. They've been doing that for a very long time. I think this harkens back to the ancient mystery cults as well, right? The divine mother, the mother nature, the divine is the divine mother. This is we see remnants of this in cults like what is it, the Demeter, who and why am I blanking on her name? But this was one of the ancient Greek mystery cults, and they would where for 6 months because of the mother was so upset, they weren't able to the land wasn't prosperous for portion of the year for 6 months of
Mhm.
the year. And I think she went underground, and I think it was six pomegranates that she got. And so this was like a major retaliation, but this is very much reminiscent of what we're seeing with this Gaia religion. I think even we see it from the Theosophists, the source, this mother nature, where they worship the earth, as opposed to, which is really so inverted when you look at it, because instead of worshiping the creator who made the earth, you worship the earth, the result, the creation. So it really is a very distorted way, in my view, of looking at things. But they've used this as a way of convincing people that we must worship Mother Earth. And then they have convinced us of this lie, this Malthusian lie. Thomas Malthus he was
Yeah.
a philosopher who believed that we had limited resources, and of course the population growth was going to lead to self-extinction because we have limited resources, and so we
So,
must, of
so
course.
the consequence of all that is to eventually bring us to the point where we recognize that man himself is the enemy of Gaia, right?
Yes. And so we have the Club of Rome Limits of Growth document, which was in 1972, where they tell us that, of course, humans are creating all this pollution. We are destroying the earth, and we must figure out how to solve this great problem. And then in their Global Revolution document in 1992, they literally admitted that that was propaganda. They said that they needed a common enemy for us to rally behind. And so they convinced us that, it was humans that were creating all of this pollution that was causing the decline and demise of the earth. And so therefore the enemy of humanity was, of course, man himself. And this is what they've used to promulgate.
But not all men, right? Mostly white men, right?
uh,
From European descent, I suppose.
Yes, well, of course, they will point to the industrialized civilizations as being the most egregious polluters. I don't know how they reconcile,
It's not true, yeah, but
not true at all. But yes, that is what they have convinced us and convinced possibly themselves. And so that's what they use as justification for, implementing these 17 sustainable development goals, which again are so deceptive, right? That it's all very clever marketing. They couch it in terms that sound like things that we would want to support, but when you look deeper at what they actually mean by those words, it's very much inverted. And so Yeah.
Wow. So about 2045, what is the expectation then? What should I tell my daughter that she is going to experience then? Like,
Well, I'm hoping their visions do not come to fruition, but we've got a lot of things, right? We had Alice Bailey, the Theosophical master, who told us that 2025 was going to be the year of Lord Maitreya. And so where that's what we're living for right now. And then she does talk about some sort of vision for, obviously, she doesn't use the term singularity, but she does talk about 2045 as some sort of a reference year. But then we have the AI World Society, which is talking about their centennial of the UN, which is, of course, 2045. And this is going to be when the AI World Society will come to fruition. And this is where all human governments will be supplanted by AI. We're going to have essentially AI everything. They're going to have Ukraine be the central hub for all of these various nodes on the map. And this is nodes that will connect to the 15-minute cities, the C40 cities, and all of these other kinds of control grids. And they talk about 6G being used to create the Internet of Nanobio things. And then they also talk about the singularity is nearer, right? This is Ray Kurzweil, the famous transhumanist, who talks about 2045 being the year for that. And then I also thought this was very interesting that I've been tracking something called Game B. And in Jim Rutt's manifesto, where he talks about a journey to Game B, he says that 2045 will be the year that we will have these proto Game Bs. And he's very versed in technology, right? He was a chairman of the Santa Fe Institute. He was the
but
CEO of Network Solutions.
forgive me for a second. What is the plan B? I'm not sure I'm familiar.
It's called Game B.
Can
And
be.
so the premise of it, the way I look at it, the way I tend to describe it, is it's the technological manifestation of the age of Aquarius. So those who are not familiar, there was actually a Stanford Research Institute did this long document. It was called Changing Images of Man. And they talk about how we have to change the consciousness of man. And it was Willis Harman was one of the predominant editors on this, and he had his assistant Marilyn Ferguson be the pseudonym for a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy, which would popularize the ideas of the changing images of man. And in a nutshell, it's essentially this notion that we're moving out of the age of Pisces, the industrial era that was very competitive and rivalrous and too much focus on the individual. And we need to move into the age of Aquarius, which centers around the collective, collaboration, cooperation, and unity. And this notion of Game B stipulates that Game A, which is what we're currently in, is too rivalrous and that we're playing a zero-sum game. And so we need to move into, again, what I call technological age of Aquarius, which is we need to move into a collective, collaborative, unified era where we are non-rivalrous and we do not compete. So this is a way that we can achieve our conscious evolution, and we can ascend towards the superorganism of humanity, if you will, as Bruce Lifton says. And the way we do it is to move into this Game B, which is non-rivalrous. And so they have a film, Initiation to Game B, just that term alone, right? It's an initiation
Initiation.
into Game B. And this outlines their vision. So they make it very clear that Game B is not it's not something that is happening now. It's not something that is a reality at this time. It is a vision. And so, but it's been in the works for a very long time, I would argue. It's not new. It was spawned from a political movement that was called the Emancipation Party. And this came out, it was born out of the Stanton meetings that Jim Rutt had organized out in Stanton, Virginia. And there were meetings with members such as people that are very prominent today, people like Brett Weinstein and Jordan Hall, who he had met at the Santa Fe Institute. He was working on something called evolutionary software that garnered the attention of Santa Fe Institute, and he became chairman of Santa Fe Institute. And so they're working on this transpolitical movement, the Emancipation Party, and then the spinoff from that became this concept of Game B. And it's very much, I think it has elements of network state. Actually, they're pending approval on the network state website currently under Balaji Srinivasan. And they're, yeah, so it's very much presented as something that is very organic and decentralized. And I do think that there are some, authentic organic members or proponents, I should say. But there's also a lot of momentum and prominence behind it. I had a theory that the intellectual dark web was operating as an influence operation for Game B. I have found an article from Andrew Cohen from Manifest Nirvana, who is very close to some of these Game B thought leaders who didn't use the term influence operation, obviously, but he very much said that it paved the way for Game B today. So,
What in your opinion, is the role of people like Jordan Peterson and this ARC organization? Something doesn't smell right, even though I really liked him some years ago. Now, every time I listen to him, I feel like, I don't know, I'm not
I,
comfortable.
I think your spidey senses are on target. So Jordan Peterson is a Jungian, right? Jung was actually a proponent of Mithraism, which is one of the ancient mystery cults, where Jung actually had a vision in his memoirs and dreams. He had a vision, a dream where he became I can never pronounce the name, so I'm not even going to try, but the lion godhead from from Mithras, the cult of Mithras. And he dreamt that he became this lion godhead. And he talks about how he has this vision of the quaternity, right? Where in Christianity you have the Trinity, and he talked about a quaternity, and the fourth godhead is Satan himself. So this is very much, not compatible with Christianity at all, and or even Judaism. And he actually talked about overthrowing, like dreams of overthrowing Christianity. So just to give you that little framework, and you can see this in Jordan Peterson. He's always talking about how we should embrace the monster, become the monster, right? That this is reminiscent of Jordan Peterson's shadow, right? Incorporate the shadow. This is a lot of these ancient mystery cults, like Kabbalism, will talk about unifying the evil, the good and evil, to create a transcendent beyond good and evil. So this is just to give people a little bit of background and context to Jordan Peterson. He's a Jungian who was a Mithrian. So even though he does his biblical series, I think it's important to understand what his reference and background is. And I don't know. His arc movement, I think, is really. I did a show. I called it the dialectical right hand path to create WEF dreams, which is a play on wet dream, but WEF, World Economic Forum dreams, because he kept saying that this was a counter to the World Economic Forum and to those types of ideas. This was the quote unquote conservative ARC, Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. However, when you look into it, a lot of their funding is coming from, places like Legatum, who are a direct client of the World Economic Forum. So, the money trail seems to be going back to the same place. And when you look at what the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship is doing, it really does look like a right-hand path. Everything's being couched in this very socially conservative and Christian veneer. But when you look deeper, it has a lot of Gnostic mystical tones. They keep talking about things like we need to rewrite the story, right? We need a better story. We need a new story. This is very similar to what the what did Joseph Campbell say, right? The hero's journey. We need to write a new story. And he was one of the editors on the Changing Images of Man. We have the Cosmoerotic Humanism book. This is First Values and First Principles on Evolving Perennialism, 41 Principles on Cosmoerotic Humanism. You can find it at theofficeofthefuture.com. And this is Mark Gaffney, David Zachstein, and Kenneth Wilber. And they are all David Temple. That's the code name. I think it was a kind of a tribute to David Temple. But they talk about how we have to rewrite the story of the universe so we can go from Homo sapiens to Homo universalis. And of course, their mentor was Barbara Marx Hubbard, who was an intellectual disciple of Teilhard de Chardin, who wanted to create the noosphere. So
Wow.
I think we're seeing a very common theme with all of these people, but with Jordan Peterson specifically, if you trace the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship back to the company names, the original company was Prosperity UK 2016. And I find that timing very interesting because I obviously can't prove this. This is speculative. But Jordan Peterson came on the map in 2016 with the Bill C-16 that he was
Yes.
speaking out against the transgender pronouns issues.
Hmm.
And that's kind of when he catapulted to fame. And I think it's very interesting that that's the timing of this Prosperity UK 2016, which became the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship. And you then start looking into some of these funding trails, which are tied directly to the World Economic Forum that they claim to be countering. And then you also look at his history. He's wearing this two-faced suit, right? Which seems to have a lot of connotations and dialectical kind of references. And then he talks about how when he was in Russia, where he went to rehab, he said he of course lost his memory. He says he was split in two, which again is a very interesting.
Maybe an MK Ultra moment there.
I
I don't
think
know.
so. That's my speculation. I do think so. I think he was unfiltered. I think he was groomed for this position to be the guru of the time. And when he speaks, it is almost like a prophet, maybe a false one,
Yeah,
perhaps.
that's how I felt. That's how I felt. What do you think about the alternative media? It seems like it's getting very big. It seems like it's supported by big money, and I think it's also part of the same narrative, just on the right side. Do
The
you
what
also see
media?
the alternative media?
Oh, yeah.
A lot of the big names, I'm not going to mention them because I don't know really who is who, but it seems like something is going on there as well. What do you think?
Oh, I would agree very much so. I call it the indie media. This is a holdover from my film days. So, for those who aren't familiar with the film industry, and it's very different today because the distribution models have completely changed. So, it's not quite the same today. But you used to have the big Hollywood studios, and they made films that may be hundreds or $200 million and huge budgets. And it's very well known that they had direct ties to things like the CIA, that would consult on their movies for operational preparation of the environment would be the militaristic term. Some people might know it as predictive programming. But so those were, obviously studio big budget films. And then you had something called like the independent, really independent. These might be your, local guy in his basement, his mom's basement, who's getting maybe still in film school or just graduated, and they're renting out the equipment from the school, and they got a bunch of friends together and they're doing a creative project. And maybe grandpa threw a few $1,000s in, and I'm just making a hypothetical scenario, but those are really independent artists. And then you have something called the indie film. Now, a SAG low budget film is like can be $1 million. I don't know about you, but I don't have $1 million in my back pocket just to create an artistic project. This is not independent to me. This is there is somebody financing. There's usually a machine attached, and they're funding it for propagandistic purposes, whether they're aware of it or not. That tends to be what's happening. So there's this indie sphere, and you saw this in the film industry where indie could be a $20 million film, and it was tied to they would have some prominent names, and there was a message that they were trying to convey. And I see a very similar thing going on in the alternative media. You have obviously independent, real people who are doing their thing and trying their best to make their way through this algorocracy, I can't even say the word algorocracy. But they're trying to break through and get their voices out there and be heard with whatever resources they may have available to them. And then you've got obviously the mainstream media, and then you've got like the mainstream alternative media, but then you have this indie sphere, which I really see as a counter Intel Pro to Operation Mockingbird. Those who are not familiar with Operation Mockingbird, this is where the CIA funded major news networks, and this is why you would see them parroting the same phrase no matter which
It's in
state.
the 50s, right?
Yes, in the
Hmm.
50s, yeah. So this has been exposed and declassified. This was a literal operation, and I don't think it ever ended, to be really honest. But we saw this during COVID, where they kept saying the threat to our democracy, right, over and over again. So the same clip was playing, no matter what channel you were on. But I think if you look at the indie media, they can be paid off for much cheaper, and is also much more obscure. It's harder to trace. It's harder to reveal. But I think something similar is still going on. And now through algorithms, it's so easy to create these cybernetic feedback loops. So I do think that it's hard to discern though, because you don't know who is who, like you said, who's who. You don't know who's being who's pulling the strings, and you also don't know who's aware. I think a lot of people may be being manipulated unwittingly. They're not aware that they are. And this creates this kind of, it plays to the hands of, and I think it also exacerbates these very egoistic and narcissistic personalities, where they think they're just genuinely, authentically worthy of whatever the likes, the clicks, the shares, and the money that comes along with it. But they're really being steered, and I don't think they realize it, because yeah.
I feel like most of the voices that we hear in the alternative media is controlled opposition, and basically they constructed some kind of a loud narrative, and we are just in the middle of that. Some people on the right, some people on the left, and all the time arguing in endless conflict. I suppose to get us to the Gnostic Jacob ladder, right? Right. Eventually,
Yeah.
this spiral you're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Yeah, the spiral of unveiling the spiral of Geist toward the world absolute. And that is exactly. And I think that right now is a really convenient time for them to play these people against each other. So I think this is kind of, you had brought up, the conflict in the Middle East, and I think this what we're seeing with a lot of that narrative does play to people who are desirous of the gnosis, right? So you have this paltering, you have these weaponization of curated truths. So you'll have elements of truths, and they're out of context, and so you're given this to an audience that doesn't have the historical context, that doesn't but they know they've been lied to, and so now they're hungry for truth, and they can anchor to something they think they've discovered. Now they have the answer, and so this creates this polarity between the people who are on one side versus the other. And then what happens from there, right? Then they can synthesize this and move the Overton windows, and that's constantly what they're doing. I see this with we saw 5 years ago, we had the medical freedom movement sweep in, and you had people who typically, when they were advocating more bodily autonomy, those people tended to be on the political left. And now the medical freedom movement sweeps in and slaps the right-wing label on them. And a lot of them were confused. They said, no, I'm on the left. He said, no, you don't want to take these things. So you're on the right. You're you're a right winger now, you're a Republican, a conservative, whatever the label may have been. And so then we see the Overton window shift, and it always shifts left because it shifts left towards collectivism. So just to clarify that, and it has to, because if it shifted towards disintegration, there would be too much pushback and chaos. So then it moves more towards the unity. And then now we have people who a year ago would never have bought an electric vehicle, and they're running out to buy Teslas because Trump has brought Elon into the administration. And so again, we see this shift of the Overton window. And I think that's what happens is a lot of people are really hungry for truth. So they know that they've been lied to, and so they're weaponizing the truth. I use this analogy of the ice cream cone. I talk about how the ice cream cone is like we know the ice cream cone's not that great for you, but you kind of want it, and it's the hook gripping lie. So you start eating the ice cream cone, you have these sprinkles, and these are the sprinkles of truth. And so you keep licking the sprinkles. You're like, oh, well, this is true. This is true. This must be good for me. It's true. And before you know it, you've eaten the whole ice cream cone, which is the hook gripping lie. So
I would like to ask, it seems like the left is numb. It went to sleep or something, or maybe I'm just not aware. And the walk is silent, the DI disappeared, the ESG is maybe changing names, the how do you call it, identity politics. What's happening with all those ideologues?
yeah, they're definitely not dying. They've just rebranded because they know that they can't use those terms, especially here in the United States with Trump. They can't be overt about it. That obviously he's going to push back on something that is labeled DEI. So we're having a overt pushback against them, but behind the scenes, what they're doing is they're renaming things, they're rebranding it, but they're still pushing the same agenda. The same agendas are because it's the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So these corporations, in order to meet their ESG scores, they have to. Otherwise they don't get their incentives. And so I had brought up something called Game B before, and there's now something called B Labs, which have their subsidiaries are B Corps. And B Corps, well, they talk about social responsibility and is it sustainability? I think so. But it's essentially the ESGs. They've just renamed it. It's not, the full ESG environmental, governance, but
Social government,
social
yeah.
governance, that's right, yeah, environmental social governance. So they've just rebranded, but it's the same thing, and it's these B corporations. There are over 6,000 of them currently, and they're very big, well-known, like Ben& Jerry's, for instance, is a B Corp, and they will tell you that they're not an ice cream company, they're a social activism company. So the activism is their priority, and it's because they meet these there's a ESG adapter score, like
Mhm.
for the B Corps. So that's what they're concerned with meeting. So this idea that DEIs did is complete nonsense. It's just been rebranded.
From a conservative traditional worldview, when you see all this abnormality from the left, it makes no sense. But then I realized that all this push is basically just to create the reaction on the other side. So their mission is to create the reaction, right? And eventually goes back to the dialectic.
Yes. So when I talk about the ancient mystery cults, there seems to be like factions that work through the political left and then through the political right. And the way I see this is that you've got the ones on the left tend to be, they worship Divine Mother, right? They tend to be very like focused on emotionality. They lead with emotions. They lead with um, yeah, they're very irrational often is how they appear because they're coming from they would say heart-centered, right? They tend to be compassionate, and compassion's interesting, right? Because it gets very much weaponized, and I think that this is kind of how you get these Gnostic elects of these identity politics groups. And what I mean by that is when you look at compassion, not that men don't have compassion, obviously they do, but you think of it as a feminine trait, right? And why do you think of it that way? It's biological. It's because women need to be compassionate towards their offspring. so that they can attend to their needs. But what happens when there's a threat to their offspring? They're not compassionate to that threat. They become vicious mama bears, right, to
Yes.
protect their offspring. And so this is what you see with these identity groups, and they tend to really play to femininity, because they're looking for the to divide these groups against each other, and that tends to operate through the left. And a lot of these various types of religious beliefs and the ancient mystery cults that are operating through them tend to be we can call it mommy issues, but they're really playing towards this feminine nature. But then you've got the through the right, which is the more patriarchal, authoritarian, disciplinarian, and I think those tend to be, at least in this country right now, in prominence currently. But I see it as a battle of these various, ancient families who subscribe to these different belief systems. And through the right, we were talking about like the Prussian model, right? The Habsburgs. This is very much the patriarchal archetype, and we've got the Knights of Malta, then the Templars, but ultimately they're still marching towards, this is that Alfhaven, spiral of the Gnostic Jacob's ladder. They're still working towards this battle. They push back and forth. So you go from one end to the other, but it's the yin yang, right? The divine mother, divine father, towards the absolute, towards the noosphere, towards the oneness, the source. So that's kind of how I see it. They play against each other, and that's not to say that there aren't warring factions between oligarchs. I do think that there are, because ultimately they're competing for power. But I do think that they play these different types of sensibilities against each other to create the pendulum swing, which ultimately marches up the Gnostic Jacob's ladder.
Do you think that we are dealing here with bloodlines, or are we dealing here with some kind of aristocracy? Help me with that. Who are just sharing this kind of philosophy?
I think it's a combination. I think people really want very simple answers. It's people want to play. I always joke that the only game people learned how to play growing up was pin the tail on the donkey. That's what you're seeing with like right now. Blame the Jews. It's like, really, you think that less than 3% of the world population are responsible for all the evil you've ever seen in the
0.3.
world? What?
0.3.
0.3. Yes. So
Yeah.
sorry. 0.3. Yeah. I mean, it's like, like I don't want to be rude, but how stupid do you have to be to believe that? It's just this desire to find the answer. Like, okay, it's them, it's their fault. We blame everything on them, and that's kind of what you see. And they're not the only ones. They're often scapegoats, but this is just the same iteration of this same game of pin the tail on the donkey that you see over and over again. And I just think the world is much more complex than that. I do think you have royal families. I do think you have, aristocratic, the oligarchs, and I do think that they compete with each other. I don't think it's all a unified, collaborative mission, because they're competing for power. They want to be the ones in charge, and I think they'll play ball with each other when it behooves them, when it serves their interest. But I think that ultimately what you do see is shared telos. And it seems to be most compatible with the Luciferian worldview. So whether or not they're Luciferians directly, like, or Satanist, I don't know. But I think that ultimately what they're operating on is that's very much that shared worldview. And, whether they believe it and subscribe to it directly or not, I think is kind of irrelevant, because that's the result. So.
Yeah. Um, in our effort to try to make a difference and to speak truth and all the rest of it, sometimes we are speaking about very sensitive or radical ideas, and then there is the danger of us negating ourselves to the people who are listening to us, because maybe we sound too extreme, maybe we cannot provide enough evidence. Are there any subjects that you recognize that we should avoid from touching because it's more damaging than helpful?
I would never make that blanket statement for people. Like, I think everybody has their strengths, their talents, and their passions. So, if they feel they can be beneficial in an area or in a discussion, then I would encourage them to do so. But
But
I,
if I may
Mhm.
give an example that I experienced here in Israel during the COVID-19,
Right.
some people who woke up, they always gave the example of Georgia Guidestones, where it says that you have to keep nature in equilibrium, and 500 million will, be the remaining ones. So when you come and say to your mother and grandmother and friends and neighbors, and you basically tell them 7.5 billion are going to die tomorrow, that's the point where you're losing them. They're not willing to listen anymore. So did you recognize that on your journey to be such an advocate of truth, like problems
Um,
like that?
yes, there are many such times where the certain people will just not listen. I the way I see it is you plant seeds, right? You never know when those seeds are going to sprout. You never know when the soil is fertile. So you plant the seeds, and then maybe at that time they're not ready to grow, but several years later they'll remember what you said, and it'll start to click, and they may end up flourishing, and running with that. So I don't look at it as trying to convince people, because I certainly don't claim to have all the answers. I don't know that I'm always right. So it's really just about planting the seeds. So,
Mhm.
like for instance, the example of the Georgia Guidestones and the reducing the population to the 500 million from the supposed 8 billion that we have today. That would be a huge drastic population reduction. So obviously we have to cull some useless eaters. But you could, whether or not that's a literal plan that they're trying to implement, you could point to, instead of trying to convince them that that's a literal direct plan that was codified in stone, you could point to some of these belief systems, like the Malthusian worldview, the Club of Rome, limits to growth. You could point to the Theosophical, like spiritual evolution, which is just a spiritual manifestation of the same evolutionary type of belief system. This, social evolution, right? Darwinian social evolution type of belief system that's really predicated on eugenics, right? It's this notion that they have positive eugenic, negative eugenics. This idea that certain people should be breeding, and then we need to cull certain others, right? And it's just same variation, but in the spiritual the evolutionary view of this is that certain people have the capacity to ascend, and they will reach these higher levels. They can become ascended masters, and the others need to be subsumed so they can be reincarnated. You evolve or die, but it's all different variations of the same premise and presupposition. And that's what you can point to, that there are these very clear belief systems, and this is a manifestation of that.
Yeah, I would like, with your permission, to go back for a second to Trump, the big savior, the one who had the Operation Warp Speed for us. Again, if you can maybe highlight to the audience, what should we look, how do you say it? What should we pay attention to in regards to Elon Musk and Peter Thiel? I think he's also somehow engaged there. And Trump himself, like, what do you see that is problematic? I would like to emphasize it a little more if you can.
Yeah, sure. So my biggest concerns, as you point out, like Peter Thiel, Elon Musk. Elon Musk, has a history, a family history. His grandfather, Josh Heidelman, was the head of Technocracy Inc. from 1936 to 1943, and although his grandfather passed when he was very young, he was very much instilled and inculcated with these ideas and visions for technocracy, and he has many times made it very clear he'd like to institute a technocracy. Of course, he usually frames it in reference to Mars, but I think that is very representative of his belief systems. And you hear him talking about things like on X, where he says, how it's instrumental for the conscious evolution of man. So, when you start to see these phrases, and the philosophical premises behind them, you can start to piece things together. And it does paint a very concerning picture, dystopian, quite honestly, to me, if you understand the belief systems behind them. So with Elon, he advocates for the everyman, and we're building for the entrepreneurial vision, and yet his entire history is partnerships with the military industrial complex. And he's now in partnership with Anduril and, all of them to do an open AI, and Sam Altman, all these characters from Silicon Valley, for a conglomerate to do defense contracts. That just went into effect pretty recently. And then you've got, of course, like his, people can buy whatever they want to buy. But I mean, even he claims that, this whole, that we shouldn't buy into the lies of the globalists. But meanwhile, he's creating, every single facet of all of his companies are instrumental in executing the fourth industrial revolution, right? We've got the Tesla cars, we've got the Skynet to create the hive mind, we've got the Neuralink, also hive mind. He's got his Boring company, wants to fund the Hadron Collider. We could go, he's got CureVac, right? The mRNA technology. We could go on and on. So I mean, that's, I think, pretty obvious. And then even with Doge, I think Doge is doing some very good things. I think absolutely the corruption and the misappropriation of tax dollars should absolutely be exposed. You're not going to get any argument from me on that. And we should reduce a lot of that spending, just, cut all of that garbage. I am absolutely in favor of that. However, I'm also concerned that he has talked about replacing a lot of this with AI. And so my hope is that we're going to see, a little bit of a buffer time, that maybe we can derail or push back some of those plans, and maybe we'll experience some opportunities in the meantime. I don't want to negate that possibility. So, we should definitely celebrate the wins where there are wins. And, you don't want, if you're too busy looking too far in the future or too far in the past, and you're too busy criticizing, you miss the opportunity. So I do want to be cautious and cognizant of that. But then, of course, you've got, Peter Thiel, who J.D. Vance is a direct protege of Peter Thiel. Elon Musk was partners with him on PayPal and several other ventures. I see a lot of this dark enlightenment philosophy very much infiltrating and infusing into the right wing of this Trump administration. Thiel, there's also this kind of, again, to put the Christianese, that exoteric veneer that I think is a little misleading. They talk about things in terms of Christian values, but dark enlightenment is very much anything but that. It's much more reminiscent of if anything, these the darker aspects, like the Crusades. This is trying to create something that is antithetical to the United States of America, where we might see something like a theocracy, but it's a good vehicle to create a technocracy, right? So I think that's kind of some of the concerns that we should be aware of. Christian nationalism, theocracy, theocratic government is directly antithetical to the American founding. So I think those are some of the things I would be also when Trump talks about how he wants to create Bitcoin as a reserve currency. I think these are not, or using some sort of stable coin. These things are concerning to me. So I think we have a lot of things that we should definitely, keep our eyes open and exercise self-governance wherever we can. That means that we hold our elected officials accountable. We push back against things that we don't want to see highlighted or move forward. And this doesn't mean that we champion a savior, or that we, that he's not
I
capable.
think that by definition, you can never have a savior who is part of a government. It's like
I would
it's
agree with that. But, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's the devil either, right? I think
no,
we need
of
to
course.
recognize that there is still free will, as far as I know.
I think that he's being played, but because he's very intelligent, he probably knows that he's just a tool, and it
I
serves
think,
him and serves them.
yeah, I think so too. I think there's I don't think that he has as much power as people would like to attribute. I think he's playing a role, and I think he's serving, himself and others in that role. So,
Yes. My last question, if I may,
yeah.
what are the solutions? And how do you think we are like faring? Do we fare well in this? I will call it a battlefield. How well are we doing, and what can we do better?
So I think there are many. I don't know if like ultimate solutions. We can only deal with what we know and what we see, and what's in our purview and our power. So, I think it's incumbent upon us to do what we can do. I would say, firstly, philosophically speaking, I think recognize dialectical agitation. So if you can see that there are affordance traps, do not buy into them. Step outside the wizard circle. If they're creating a scenario that looks like a false binary, you don't have to go inside either. And I think one test of this is it trying to convince you that this is for the greater good, then it is probably a lie, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
because speaking just again from the biblical framework, I think God advocates for the individual, and so that he wants to preserve the free will of humanity, and the opponent is looking to create the collective noosphere, which might guide us towards the singularity. So I think that's the first step. I think also philosophically speaking, try to uncover what is real, what is grounded in reality, and that will be a good compass for uh, where you go and what you build upon. So I think that's from a philosophical, a metaphysical, and epistemological stance, that's a good starting ground, and that will also give you kind of a guide towards what to engage, because I think oftentimes we're steered into a lot of psyops and dialectical warfare, and so that might help you to step out of that.
Mhm.
And then in terms of what people can do is take seize opportunities where you can. So I think, I believe we were all endowed with unique gifts, strengths, and talents, and it's incumbent upon us to hone those, develop them, so that we can be of contribution to the world. And so for everybody, that might look different. For some people, that might be, instilling the values you want to see. Expounded upon in the world in your children, by educating them and spending time with them and teaching them right for wrong. For some people, that might be taking some control over whatever land you have, maybe farming and, getting away from this synthetic terraforming of agriculture. For other people, it might be getting involved politically, locally, in whatever capacity, whatever that looks like for you. It may be in creating technological innovation that is independent, truly independent, that's outside of any kind of oligarchical control or surveillance. But ultimately, I think it's really about preserving free will. So, when in doubt, probably do not comply. So, and I think it starts there. So, but yeah, I think it looks different from every person. But I think you should look to your unique strengths, talents, and passions as the guide.
Yeah. Courtney, you're incredible, really. This is such a delight. Thank you so much. Can you kindly tell my audience where they can find you? What are you working on? When is your book coming out?
Yes. So you can find me at CourtenayTurner.com. I spell my name if you're seeing it. That's that way behind me. Courtenay, CourtenayTurner.com. And that will be the best place to find all of my various podcast platforms, social media, all the things I'm working on. And then also my Substack, Courtney's Substack. You can find that on my website as well. But my website will have various ways that you can support the work I'm doing. And of course, my Substack, if you become a paying subscriber, you will get access to all of my podcasts, ad free and early access. And I do have my book on there, the developmental stage. As I said, I'm still very much in work on it. It's a very much a work in progress. I'm really hoping to have it out sometime in June, and I probably will be self-publishing, but I'm looking into a pre-order option for people, because a lot of people have asked that already. So I am looking into that. And yeah, so the next 7 chapters that I've outlined are much more conceptual, so I need some time to kind of sit with them. But yeah, so I'm still doing the podcast. I also do a show with Dr. Lee Merritt, The Dangerous Dames, every Monday. That's 5 Central on Mondays. And we're also going to be launching a tallow business. So with tallow skincare products. So you can stay tuned for that. That'll be on my website and my various platforms as well. And yeah, I think that's
And when you come to Israel to visit, maybe we can speak about translating your book to Hebrew. Who knows?
love that. That would
Yeah,
be awesome. Yeah.
we should do that. Yeah. Any final thoughts? Anything that you think we should mention and we forgot? Something which is very important and relevant to, our days today?
Um, no, I think we covered quite a bit. Yeah. Thank you so much. This was a delight. I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you very much. It's absolutely my how to say it, like my pleasure, and I'm delighted. I was really hoping that you would come on, and thank you very much, Deb, for helping out.
Yes,
So
Deb. We love Deb.
yes, so with your permission, I will end the recording, and I thank you again very much. Thank you
Thank
so much.
you. Yeah.